Today we're going to talk a little bit about the early civil rights, the amendments that happened right after the Civil War, and also then some of the southern states' responses to those amendments, trying to get around those laws. One thing to keep in mind, the 13th Amendment means that there was 12 amendments before that. The first 10 of those were the Bill of Rights. And then after the 12th Amendment, it was over 60 years until any other changes were made in the Constitution. Now, an amendment is not just a law, it is an actual change to the Constitution, so it's a big deal. The 13th Amendment was in 1865. It officially made slavery illegal. What had happened during the war is President Lincoln had quote-unquote freed the slaves, but not all the slaves. There were some slaves in the border states who were not covered. And Lincoln was also concerned, as well as some other people were concerned, that the Emancipation Proclamation that had freed those slaves would be considered something only done during war, and so it wouldn't be effective, or wouldn't be in effect after the war was over. So the 13th Amendment officially makes slavery illegal throughout the whole United States, North, South, border states, everything. Now the 14th Amendment is, I think is probably one of the most interesting ones. Keep in mind three things. Its goals were to promise three things. One, citizenship, guaranteed citizenship for all Americans, specifically for ex-slaves. Due process, which it's a fancy way of saying is that the government can't take away something without either you going to court for it or being compensated for it. And number three, equal protection, so that regardless of who you were, if you're a citizen of the United States, regardless of your economic status, your race, the color of your skin, that you would be treated the same under the law. So those three things, that were the goals of the 14th Amendment, were to promise citizenship, due process, and equal protection. Now, of those three, I think the most interesting one is the first one, is citizenship. This is something, it's an issue we even deal with today with if you are born in the United States, if your parents are not citizens of the United States, but yet you are born in the United States, you are considered a United States citizen. That's an unusual thing. Keep in mind, the original intent of the 14th Amendment was to protect those people, specifically the slaves, who had been born in the United States but had never been given citizenship. This was a way to ensure and to guarantee that if they were born in the United States, they automatically would have citizenship. So the 14th Amendment today is, when we consider immigration, specifically illegal immigration, this is an issue that is still being brought up today. The 15th Amendment was very straightforward. Is the idea behind the 15th Amendment was not being able to deny somebody the right to vote based on their race, their color, or their past history of being a slave. Now, it's the 15th Amendment that really is attacked later on. States try to find ways, and effectively they do find ways, to get around the 15th Amendment. These were laws that came to be known as Jim Crow laws. The states essentially didn't like being told what to do. Now, Jim Crow, the idea behind it, this was an actor, as I've got a picture here up on the screen. He was a character of performers that would go from town to town and perform stage shows. Essentially, they didn't have movies back then. A form of entertainment was you would have entertainers going from town to town, and they would perform shows for you. One of these characters that were very famous was a character by the name of Jim Crow. It would be a white person that would dress as a black person and put coal dust and such on their face to try to imitate and mimic what a black person might look like, a homeless black person, a transient black person might look like. If you think of him as a character rather than as a person, it might be like Jason Bourne or maybe even James Bond. There's several characters who played James Bond, and his character is the same, even though different actors have played him. That was a similar thing as what Jim Crow was. Keep in mind some of the simple, these laws were just referred to as Jim Crow laws. The idea behind them was to keep white people and black people separate. And it was also to deny black people the right to vote. Some of the examples here that I have up here: bus stations, railroads, restaurants, schools, restrooms and water fountains were all segregated. Movie theaters are segregated, cemeteries, parks, just about anything you could imagine were segregated. Here's an example. I believe this is in Alabama. You can see the bathrooms are segregated, as well as the drinking fountains. If you look at this picture right here, you'll see that this is probably in my guess is probably around the 1930s. You can see that there are two entrances There's one on the left hand, the door says white, and the one on the right hand says colored. Many restaurants didn't even have a separate door for somebody who is of color. They would be required, if they wanted to order anything, they would have to go to the back kitchen door, order from that, and then eat outside. But here are some examples of some Jim Crow laws specifically for lunch counters. Now, this was challenged in the court and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. There was a gentleman by the name of Homer Plessy. The interesting thing about Homer Plessy is he was 1/8 black. Now that meant the legal definition of being black, which is, if you do your math, and no, this isn't a math class, so that would make him 7/8 something else. So he was majority not black. But by legal definition, because he was 1/8, he was considered black. He bought a ticket and sat in the white-only railroad car. He did this knowing that he would get kicked off, or at least be given a ticket. The idea behind this was to challenge this law and eventually take it through the court system. That is an effective way to get a law changed, is sometimes use the court systems. If you can't get your congressmen or your legislatures to change a law, then go through the court system and have the courts determine that that law is unconstitutional. Homer Plessy took his court case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically didn't want to make a decision on this one. They looked for the middle road, the easy road, and they decided that, you know what, we're going to try to appease both people, we're not going to try to make a stand. They came up with a doctrine called separate but equal. They basically said businesses and public facilities, including schools, can be separate based on race as long as they're equal. What you'll find, though, is over the next decades, separate but equal really never was equal. They were separate, but they weren't equal. Some other ways to disenfranchise black citizens was to take away the right to vote. One of these attempts to do it, and it was a successful attempt, was if you wanted to vote, you had to pay a tax when you went to the polling booth. The question comes to be here is if you have very limited resources, this is the type of tax that really is going to target a specific group of people, and that's going to be poor people. If you have to decide whether you want to vote or if you want to spend that money on food or housing, whatever it might be, very likely you're not going to spend it on voting. That's what happened. The poll tax was effective in keeping black citizens from having exercising their right to vote. Literacy tests. I'm going to put up an example here of a literacy test as well too. Some states did not require that whites had to take a test, but even if whites had to take a literacy test, their test many times was much easier than what was given to a black person. I'll show you some of these. One example is from Alabama from the mid-1960s, given to a black person. You would see that a test like this, most of us would fail trying to pass this test. And if you didn't pass the test, you weren't able to vote. So literacy test, again, was another way to try to keep whites to vote and blacks from the right to vote. The last one I want to talk about is the grandfather clause. And this was the kind of the kill-all way to get around. Of all the Jim Crow laws, this was one that really kind of put the nail in the coffin and kept black people from voting. Some states passed a law that said black citizens could vote, but only if their grandfather had the right to vote. Now let me ask you, for many of these people, their grandfathers were slaves. So it was impossible, by the way that the law was designed, it was impossible for their grandfathers to have had the right to vote because they were slaves. And as slaves, they were not citizens. And as not being citizens, they had no rights. So it was a simple way to essentially eliminate all black people from having the ability to be able to vote.